We have only 3 panelists in this panel. Each of them will, all of them will talk about issues related to small markets, policy perspectives on online distribution and data infrastructures. And the first one is Ira Wegman from Carleton University, and his talk is called Small Middle Single Tests, Rescaling Peripheral Media Markets.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your endurance here. Much appreciated. My mother once told me that one day I would be on the big screen. So I wanted to thank Peter and Johanna for getting me really, really close to being there here today and for an incredibly stimulating conference so far. Okay, so today I wish to contribute to our productive conversation by talking about the presence of global streaming platforms in the Canadian context, with a particular emphasis on Netflix. In 2010, Netflix was the first country chosen, or sorry, Canada was the first country chosen by Netflix to explore its international ambitions, and the first to be delivered to consumers as a streaming service independent of its status as former DVD rental service through the mail. Its take-up was immediate and significant, securing 1 million subscribers in the first 6 months, and eventually claiming between 30 to 40% of downstream traffic in peak viewing hours. An extensive phone survey recently found that 48% of Canadian Anglophones subscribed to Netflix. Estimates peg subscription numbers at 6.5 million, putting the company as easily the most powerful in a group of what now amounts to over 20 over-the-top streaming services now available in Canada, with a few more on the way. Netflix's presence in Canada signaled a powerful appearance into a highly concentrated media landscape dominated by a small number of large vertically integrated firms that are integrated into an elaborate regulatory apparatus meant to support domestic cultural production and moderate the flow of culture from outside. Its disruptive effect prompted hand-wringing and anxiety within the industry, but it has been met with a surprisingly light regulatory touch, posing questions about how digital platforms have resisted the kinds of policy interventions applied to other border-hopping media technologies in Canada's history. For our purposes, the Canadian case is useful to think about some of the methods and concepts we use to study media systems. Some of these things have come up to my benefit so far today. I think we can think of these methods and concepts along 2 lines. One has to do with scale, the issue of how we determine the size of media systems and delineate the boundaries around the object we are attempting to study. In 2009, Anna McCarthy wrote that the various technological methodological procedures that organize research through scale are crucial for managing uncertainties about how to link conceptual and or material objects that are of different degrees of size and abstraction. That said, a flippant and probably irresponsible reaction to that sentiment would be to say that media studies has long struggled with problems of scale and how to determine the size and relative weight of the object under study, or about the political implications of imposing one form of measurement onto a particular kind of media activity or population or context. Such issues are even more pressing as we grapple with the impact of the various kinds of digital platforms on various forms of audio-visual production. One place to think about the scale problem in the field is to consider the slippery concept of markets in our work. In a very suggestive article, Patrick Vonderow makes the incisive observation that Spotify folds markets into each other in the service of broader logics of financialization and as part of activities he describes as forms of brokerage. This is a very persuasive position, and it inspired me to think about how digital platforms reshape the characteristics of markets, but also to think about the steps that happen before the folding and intermingling that he describes take place. One way to do this is to think about how media markets have been characterized before and to ask about the consequences of those forms of characterization in the present day, a question that gains particular currency here in Europe, now being described as a digital single market by Brussels. Halvard Moe and Kari Kapanen observed that we often talk about markets in the institutional sense, in terms of goods and services and value generated in the marketplace, and in more metaphorical terms as a kind of shorthand for understanding the values of a given culture or society. Today, I want to briefly mention 3 different market abstractions that blend the two together. Small, middle, and test. And as you can see, this is signaling some of the things I'm going to be talking about. While the example here that I'm discussing is from Canada, we can consider the relationship between how we characterize markets in East and Central Europe as small or new or emerging or post-socialist, for example, and now, of course, as components in single markets, and the way we have understood the nature of audiovisual industries within those contexts. The point is not to dispense with categories like small, which comes up a lot today, but to develop a more robust vocabulary of the terms we use to scale media-related markets. Netflix's arrival and the response to it by the country's major media industries is a reflection of the way it has been, the country, Canada, has been imagined as a small media market. The small in the Canadian case is a relational term, referring to the idea that a large landmass with a population concentrated on its southern portion and in proximity to the United States placed its media industries at a major advantage. From the 1920s until the 1970s, Canada's smallness was a major feature of cultural nationalist rhetoric that various measures needed to be put in place to ensure protection and prevent against cultural imperialism from the South. This sentiment has been fueled in large part by situations where U.S. media industries historically considered Canada to be an extension of their territorial market in counting revenues or box office results, a continental single market, if you will. Such a characterization has served as the basis for nearly 100 years of fairly aggressive policy interventions in the field of cultural production, which included the nationalization of radio broadcasting from the 1930s to the 1960s, the establishment of a system of public and private media industries since the 60s, operating with significant funds to support the production, distribution, and exhibition of films, television programs, popular music, and other forms of cultural production. A recognition that competing with Hollywood was a useless enterprise, both in terms of production and at the box office, encouraged policymakers to develop policies that encouraged participation in what were once peripheral areas of cultural production, such as documentaries or animation, which came up earlier, or art house cinema. Content regulations established for television and radio starting in the 1960s and 70s stimulated the development of an independent production sector. Support for the protection of territorial rights and intellectual property regimes and restrictions on foreign ownership encouraged the development of powerful media corporations, companies whose holdings now extend across media platforms and from telecommunications into broadcasting and so on. A major argument supporting this development was the belief in the 90s that Canada needed strong media companies to compete in a global market, even if those companies have been relatively inactive in that market during their time of conglomeration. The language of small is familiar to many of you today, and it reminds us of the literature on media in small nation contexts. As valuable as this literature is in describing the way those nations contend with powerful neighbors or produce creative alliances to work through situations of scale, a prevailing feature of much small nations research is that the smallness is never defined, or when it is, reflections on the ramifications for thinking small are rarely considered. In Mette Hjort's work on cinema in small states, gross domestic product is one of the determinative measures, but there's little analysis about why this is the appropriate measure to use, or how thinking with GDP makes assumptions about media as commodity forms that may not be viable. Whether it is appropriate for accounting for the presence of free culture, that is a big thing of online life, and whether there are any downsides for thinking of power, in this case cultural power, in quantifiable terms. Other terms used by Hjort, such as population or territory, or history of rules by non-co-nationals, are also offered without much description or rationale. These kinds of characterizations lead us to consider which countries are used as points of reference, or how countries are scaled against one another. Such characterizations also provide few signposts about what criteria would allow a nation to exit its small nation status. The relative lack of self-reflection on the consequences of this kind of categorization can have serious consequences. In Canada, we can say that the country's mistaken self-imagination in relation to the United States, or in France, in the case of Quebec, has historically contributed to discourses of absence and weakness in the Canadian system. That last point is instructive because, as my Carleton colleague Dwayne Winsek has pointed out, the small moment for Canada has been over for distant memory. Canada has the eighth largest, according to Dwayne, the eighth largest media economy in the world, similar to South Korea, which is itself a product of significant transformations within the media economy over the last 30 years, in addition to technological transformations brought on by digital technologies. In Canada and various Canadian cultural producers participate in a range of major media sectors, most notably in popular music, format television production and exchange, dramatic TV production, and in gaming. In spite of this, the popular perception of Canada as small routinely occupies its place in public discourse, perhaps not surprisingly from those companies whose livelihoods have been most affected by Netflix's arrival. Others have explored what would happen if we considered Canadian cultural production along different lines, ones that might take some of those market lacks or absences into account. In the case of cinema, Jerry White believes that positioning Canada in the context of other countries like Belgium and Switzerland represents the most relevant points of comparison, not only because of their smallness, but because of the fact that both countries function through balancing interests of different regions and linguistic cultures, both contend with matters having to do with separatism, and which must balance those features in the development of media policies and audiovisual cultures. In a different vein, Diana Crane remarked that one of the distinctive characteristics of what she calls medium producer nations is the way cultural policies, quote, contribute to the maintenance and even growth of national film industries, but do not increase their capacity to challenge the domination of the American film industry in the global market. From her analysis from 2009, which we acknowledge is dated here, from her analysis of a sample of films from 2009, we can see that Canada leads a group of countries that includes Brazil, Indonesia, and Hong Kong in terms of the number of films produced. When market share of those firms is taken into account, the country ranks closer to Taiwan, and once again, the Swiss. If number of films in the national top 10 is taken into account, Crane's analysis shows that Canada is grouped with the Philippines, or Iran, or Belgium. In a recent large-scale comparison of 100 different countries, Mauricio Bustamante situated Canada among countries like Egypt, or Chile, or Germany, when considered according to levels of support for cultural policies and of balances between private and public spending. Seeing Canada in relation to places like South Korea, or Belgium, or Egypt offers the promise of something closer to a more subtle analysis of the specificity of the Canadian experience, which mixes policy measures aimed at managing inflows of cultural texts from elsewhere with those that encourage the development of talent to serve domestic and international markets of varying sizes. Such middle market status allows us to appreciate the way Canada developed a sets of institutions and policy instruments to provide the means for a range of mediated forms of expression for a country operating in proximity to the United States, and in its attempt to become active participants in global media systems in the form of works produced for domestic and global audiences, in specific market segments, and in major service sectors. Now, of course, we have a sector that works to generate content for platforms such as Netflix, works whose production or distribution involves traditional broadcasting partners, and takes advantage of the durability of territorial rights markets, as we can see here in the company's recent decision to partner with a major Canadian broadcaster to air and then eventually stream the reunion of the popular sketch comedy program SCTV, if you like Martin Short, for example. And here, where Canada is one of a group of, interestingly lumped together in North America here too, is one of a group of rights markets to stream Canada's foreign language Oscar entry on Body and Soul. Here Canada gets lumped together with countries like South Africa or Pakistan or Bangladesh, for example. These various streams of activity have given Canada's cultural industries a degree of scale and financial heft consistent with other countries who may occupy the middle producer status. What is surprising at this point is how little the state has been involved in attempting to regulate Netflix's activities. At various times, attempts to encourage Netflix to contribute a percentage of their revenues to support production, an expectation which is standard for broadcasters in the traditional sense, were immediately positioned by politicians from different political parties as Netflix taxes that would result in higher prices. And Canada's Minister of Canadian Heritage, Jillian mentioned this briefly, recently wrapped up an investigation into the state of Canadian culture online, with an announcement that Netflix has agreed to donate $500 million to support Canadian production, news that was pilloried in the press as tepid and weak, because there are no oversight mechanisms to say, well, or else what? There were no promises. In fact, the biggest critique of Netflix came from a market within Canada that was even smaller than the supposedly small national market. The province of Quebec met the Netflix announcement with fury, saying that there was no way of forcing Netflix to spend the money or to devote it to French language productions. Recently, its provincial government has decided to do what the federal government has not, which is to apply provincial sales tax to Netflix for subscribers in the province. Such is a reminder of the power of even smaller locales, provinces, regions, and cities as key actors in various attempts to bring digital platforms to heel. Authorities in cities like Brussels have played a role in banning Uber through regional administrative organizations associated with traffic. A temporary injunction against Uber was issued by a regional court in Brno, here in the Czech Republic in 2017, before the company cut a deal with the government. A regional court found that Facebook's data collection was in violation of German consumer law, for example. It may well be that in the history of the regulation of these platforms, these really small markets and jurisdictions may be very big in the process of establishing the regulatory apparatus that eventually domesticates the once resistant global platforms. A third and final market abstraction that I think might be valuable to our discussion here before I wrap up, and this is the test market. The concept drawn from the worlds of advertising and marketing, in which a group of people are selected to try out new products and provide feedback before they are launched to wider audiences. Test markets overlap nicely with ideas we understand from the case study model in social science research and raise issues about sampling size and scale and representativeness, as they are usually supposed to stand in for a much larger group of people. A number of different places and locales have often performed in this capacity. As mentioned before, Canada was the first country to get Netflix outside of the United States, both as a nationally available service and as a standalone streaming service, and the country is now performing a similar role as so here you can see quotes talking about the fact that, depending on what happens in Canada, this will determine what Netflix does. I guess it worked. But the country is performing a similar role as the test case for CBS's streaming platform, All Access. Such an example can serve as an inspiration for thinking about the other ways that Canada has been used as a test market for digital platforms. For example, Facebook has used Canada a few different times that we know of, at least. First, to try out its service of making free phone calls on its service, and recently to test out its advertising transparency efforts during a provincial election, which is coming up in the province of Ontario, with an eye to refining the algorithms in time for the upcoming U.S. midterm elections next year. I think they're also doing an experiment in Ireland, I believe, around an abortion referendum, if I'm not mistaken. Such is a reminder of the geography of test marketing, where cities often, here again, the announcement from Facebook saying that they're going to test it out in Canada and then roll it out somewhere else. Such is a reminder of the geography of test marketing, where cities often stand in for the whole. The Canadian city of London, Ontario, which is located halfway between Toronto and Detroit, is widely known as Canada's best test market, where everything from ATMs to different kinds of food products are tested out. Because ad marketers believe that the size of London's size, about 300,000, it's relatively wealthy, and it's literally between Canada and the U.S., makes it an ideal market for testing things out. But there are other examples. Here's one: the American city of Denver is the test market for Walmart's online shopping service, or places as diverse. We know about an article here from The Economist about New Zealand as what they're calling guinea pigs for testing out new things. Countries routinely advertise themselves. Some countries routinely ad themselves like, "Come, we are the best test market for you." Here from Flanders, another one here encouraging export and investment in Brussels. Such markets are usually cited as ideal because they either represent cross-sections of larger populations, but in these contexts, as media test markets, they are also cited for high degrees of media literacy or possess powerful levels of media infrastructure. In this sense, if we were to think retrospectively, we could consider the way specific market segments like independent music or film companies serve as places where the industry tests out new content or modes of delivery. So that mentioned there in Jillian's talk and in Stuart's question about about other channels being places where you can test out talent to see if it'll work. Or how large digital platforms use certain kinds of users on their sites as sub-brands to test out things that they can place on the main stage, such as Amazon's use of Twitch, its video gaming platform, as focus groups for new television shows, or Google's Sidewalk Labs using the Canadian city of Toronto's waterfront district to test out its new Smart City initiative. Obviously, this paper has opened more doors than it can reasonably close in 20 minutes. But what I hope to have done here, is, by talking about the Canadian case, is to encourage us to develop a more subtle set of terms to understand the impact of digital platforms on screen and media industries. Such a move may not result in us never using categories like small to refer to media environments. That's not my intention here at all. but to develop a more subtle set of concepts to further define and refine the terms that we use to scale the activities and effects of audiovisual media industries. If digital platforms fold and integrate different markets in new and powerful ways, as Van der Rohe's article suggested earlier, it pays to think a little more about the ways we have understood those different markets to better appreciate the character of the new folded hybrid forms these platforms produce. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ira, for your interesting insights into the question of scale and rescaling and terminology also. The next speaker is Vicki Meyer. Mm-hmm. Vicki will be speaking about the second coming media hour for data centers.
Actually, not really, but thank you. So I pull up my last book, which came out last year, which really was about media industries, and is a free download. It's open access through the University of California Press. So if you're interested in my work on media industries, this is the book to download. And I'm not going to talk about it. And at first I was going to talk about Media Aura, and then I had a long conversation with Peter on email where he asked me to talk about globalized digital infrastructure vis-a-vis small state government oversight. So that's the title of my talk. And I'm going to make two cardinal sins. I'm doing new field work right now. So I have, at this hour of the evening, I'm breaking two rules. One is I have no images. And the second is I'm going to read a paper that I've never read to anyone before. So take a good nap. It was the mid-1980s in the Netherlands. The global economic crisis had finally pushed the Dutch central government to act decisively to get people back to work. It began by eliminating the rosters of the unemployed. Beginning in 1982 and stretching until the last global crisis in 2008, the central government reduced benefits and increased requirements for all age and ability groups. Employers became responsible for more of their employees' benefits. University programs without perceived future job prospects were cut. By 2006, the Netherlands had carved its populations into two groups with quite different rules concerning their social rights. Most people would be on workfare, having their rights dependent on labor market participation, while a stubborn group of non-participants would remain on welfare. In Groningen, an area, a region, and a city in the north of the Netherlands with an outsized population of these welfare recipients, something had to be done. The Economic Technological Institute of Groningen, representing the entrepreneurial likes of Big Ag, the gas industry, and manufacturing, called for a study that would emphasize the positive openings in the regional economy. Their report, The Northern Economy, made it clear, quote, "The goal of this report is for entrepreneurs and managers to counteract the image of unluckiness and malaise concerning economic development possibilities in the North." Public relations personnel were on the ready. The national campaign, catchy, gaat niets boven Groningen, there's nothing above Groningen, began in 1989. The main audience for the campaign were Nederlanders to the west, where politicians and elites could allocate funds in the name of welfare recipients and create that new economic image. At about the same time, the largest employers in Groningen, in the city this time, not in the province, had their own objectives in seizing the crisis as an opportunity. A top priority was to develop their own private information infrastructure, which would create efficiencies in production logistics, information storage, and communications. The KPN monopoly on telecommunications had been a target ever since the publicly managed company started controlling the infrastructure and pricing from its home base in Groningen. Even KPN wanted restructuring to sell services to the business community with less oversight. The company's privatization in 1993 and subsequent 5 years of deregulation had not helped. Groningen internet visionary Bix Jacobsen commented that telematics access via either KPN or its cable competitor Kabelcom were 10 times higher than what businesses were paying in Amsterdam. There, competition came from the Amsterdam Exchange, which began private partnerships in 1997. In addition, much of the northern region lacked even proper ICT cabling. A survey published in 2001 revealed that nearly 50% of businesses lacked sufficient cable access. In meeting the challenges, business leaders approached the city's 2 cash-strapped universities with a win-win proposal in something then called Information Technologies and Telematics. Catchy. Working together, they would lay the groundwork for what would later be called the Google Cloud. People who remembered the early days of the internet in Groningen reflected on this time as an example of cooperation. Groningen University operated one of the country's 2 supercomputing centers, a result of central government planning to locate astronomy research programs there in the 1960s. The Rekenhall Computing Center was already connected to Amsterdam under the auspices of CERN, but Groningen lacked connectivity and room to grow. A new data center housed at the Science Park needed outside investors under the current economic conditions. At least one active local politician, Koen Schouwling, the economics affairs alderman from the conservative VVD party, supported the transformation of the university's public infrastructure into a market competitor. By renting space in the data center, a practice we call co-location, businesses could avoid the cable telephone duopoly over ICT telecommunications, and the public university would grow off the rents of private businesses. Schouwling worked to attract Tyco to lay the fiber cable infrastructure that would then connect the campus to the Eemshaven port, where it then connected to the underwater cables reaching to the UK and Germany. Tyco also constructed its own data hotel, which managed through a real estate group called SIG Telehousing. In 2002, the Groningen Internet Exchange, founded by Jacobsen, became the nonprofit cooperative for switching data between the university, government, and business members. They shared exchange-connected server spaces at the Rekenhall and the Zernike Data Hotel, making use of the Tyco network. Soon after, Schouwling would be part of the delegation in search of a flagship company that they could depend on to pay the rent. In 2004, Schouwling refused to confirm or deny rumors to the TV news that Google was coming. He stated simply that his efforts traveling to the US had paid off. And it was in the last year before the new millennium that economic needs driving the production of private ICT infrastructure met the political needs to reduce the appearance of unproductive welfare citizens. Foreshadowing the new data center, Schouwling wrote in the University Computing newsletter, quote, "Knowledge is therefore a sector in Groningen that is growing very fast and continues to grow. It is one of the most important pillars for the economic policy of the municipality of Groningen. And of course, it is with the aim of creating work. What had been a public campaign to subsidize agricultural and industrial expansion to reduce the welfare rosters now became a rally to use public goods to better service private ICT development, ICT innovations, and a new class of ICT workers and entrepreneurs." This is the prehistory to Google's arrival in Groningen, and I think it's important because it shows that Google was the imagined solution to institutional, governmental, and business elites' problems in 2 ways. First, in restructuring the governance of public goods. And second, in treating labor as an image problem to be resolved with campaigns for ICT innovations. Easterling Keller calls these two aspects together extra statehood, a process he locates in the developing world, not in one of the richest countries on earth, and in illiberal countries, not one held up as a model of social democracy by many standards. In the first case of governance, Google supplied the reliable and steady capital flow for the transformation of public infrastructure services into privatized goods at the hands of semi-public landlords. Beginning in 2004, Google filled so many server racks in the science park, up to 90% estimated one of the data center workers, that the real estate company managing the data center decided to open a second and bigger one directly in the Eemshaven port. There, data centers had closer access to high voltage energy and an expanding network of sea cables. The energy industry, also deregulated, by the way, in 1998, was split now between an array of gas, wind, and coal energy suppliers that now separated, were now separated from the sole energy infrastructure operator called Tenant. The sea cable industry, which was dominated by Tata, which took over Tyco's investments after bankruptcy, was looking to expand to Denmark and Norway. And the port itself came under new management that saw profit in becoming a service provider to these industries. Quote, "It's vital that you offer more value than a piece of land," said a manager for the Public Harbor Authority, which managed the Eemshaven port, and actually the port had ownership shares in the land, the energy supply, the energy transfer, the data fiber, and the shipping quays for all the industries housed there. In 2008, the TCN Real Estate Group opened the new data hotel in the Ames port, and soon after, Google started slowly moving their operations there as the sole lessee. Under the auspices of a pseudonym, Google wanted complete privacy, said another person who was close to the operation. Still, when new companies in data, energy, sea cables, and the port needed rents most, Google was there. It came out later in a newspaper investigation that a top executive at Google actually bribed TCN to settle in the Eemshaven in a payola scheme that apparently funded a horse farm in North Carolina. Everyone, it seemed, got paid. Google also bolstered the cooperative efforts of a rising digital economy class, which had been trying since the 1990s to rebrand the region from welfare-laden to workforce-ready. As the public sector welfare numbers dropped into workfare numbers, the public university and institutions that benefited from Google's presence now joined forces to direct public attention away from unemployment rosters and towards entrepreneurship registries. These entrepreneurs, with their incubating IP and their project-based collaborations, would be the future data center customers. Nice, right? No fewer than 7 semi-public organizations with the aim of promoting and supporting digital innovations, online entrepreneurship, and startup that would require, all of which require private data servers, right? Launched between 2004 and 2014. And all of these have been underwritten by the province and the universities in conjunction with large regional employers, both public and private. The founders of the Groningen Exchange became the first one to start such an organization called Groningen Internet Valley, which was targeting especially young, innovative entrepreneurs and helping them, quote, thrive in the market. And to do this, Internet Valley just so happens to have at its disposal, quote, a very advanced technical infrastructure with a deployment platform, servers, storage equipment, access to broadband internet, and remote control in a modern data center, end quote. In addition to these data and telecommunications services, startups have access to venture capital, low-interest loans, co-working spaces, property and licensing services, and a bevy of mentorship opportunities funded again in the spirit of cooperation, samenwerking between the province, universities, the port, and the Northern Development Agency. The PR campaigns around these organizations, also underwritten with public money, represent the entrepreneurs who are both the beneficiaries and the customers of the publicly subsidized capital, real estate, and infrastructure. Unlike the Nothing Above Groningen campaign to rebrand the region, new campaigns started to redirect their attention on employment completely to just focusing on young talent in a, quote, startup culture, in a, quote, internet city. These were like the buzzwords. No longer directed specifically at The Hague, campaigns now narrowcast in English to transnational technology firms and future entrepreneurs who embrace that, quote, the internet is not the final piece, but only the beginning of a digital revolution, end quote. The city celebrates the interlinkages between ICT and this very select group of regional workers in startup weekends, hackathons, and an outdoor entrepreneurship festival cleverly named Let's Grow. Google moved from being a silent partner in extra statescraft to a public participant when in 2014 it trumpeted a 600 million euro investment in its own data center. The move came at a particularly convenient time. TCN had declared bankruptcy in 2012 after the real estate crash, and that left the port without a paying tenant. The Regional Development Agency now held the financial risk for liquidating the company assets for the data center. Google could now be the crown jewel in the economic development messaging to attract future occupants to the empty Eemshaven Data Hotel, now renamed Green Data Port. Further, they could finally recast those thousands of people that they had rotated into workfare programs as potential temporary construction workers for the new property, which was going to be 40 soccer fields big. Quote, at a time of high unemployment throughout Europe, the project promises a welcome infusion of jobs that do not require PhDs in computer science, reported the company's website. Google could also be counted on to provide a publicly available labor report estimating that the data center, which only would ultimately employ directly 150 people, would actually create 600 multiplier jobs in Groningen. I would help you break down that multiplier, but unfortunately, that, as well as all figures provided around data centers, are proprietary. With this, Google helped close the circle, transforming the image of regional welfare into an ICT-enabled workforce. The fact that the number of workers required by ICT growth would never outpace and certainly never diminish actual unemployment was actually never a goal for the image campaign. Behind closed doors, authorities for the innovation economy stated that most of the people still on welfare, they expected never to find jobs again. Quote, we have to accept that many of these people will not work in the new economy, said a local digital economy booster in Politico. But he was ready with the silver lining, quote, we want to make sure their kids will have a better working future in the new economy. And of course, Google is an investor in that, creating digital learning schools while touting the future workforce as IT talent. Do I have like 5 minutes? Or 2 minutes? I just want to I had more to say, but then I figure I would stop here because most of you are probably going, WTF? What does this have to do with media industries? So I just want to highlight 3 things that I think this might have to do with why I'm here. I think that one thing that we have to keep in mind is that Google's power in the marketplace is actually follows a series of government policy decisions that not only have to do with infrastructure, but have to do with things like labor, benefits, schooling, all of these things that don't get considered when we talk about creative policy or innovation policy. Two, many of the transformations that we see in digital economies, labor becomes the alibi publicly. It's always about creating jobs, creating young talent, creating this future workforce. And three, I think we need to look at cloud histories, because these practices of extra statescraft don't only happen in the developing world, but in regions where that might be peripheral in relation to the nation. And this follows really directly on what Ira's saying. But Groningen has always had this kind of tense relationship with Amsterdam as always the center for standing in. And I was thinking about this guy who was like, he doesn't like coming to Prague. And I just thought, who's from like another part of the Czech Republic. And I just thought, this is something that we have to think about, not just small markets, but what can we learn about the hierarchies of territoriality and region within small markets. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Vicki, for your narrative performance, which I think has everything to do with media industries. And the next speaker is Philip Drake with his from Queen Margaret University with his speech called "Walking with Which Way: Assessing Digital Distribution Policies for European Film."
Thank you very much. I'm just going to set up my PowerPoint. Thank you, everyone, for staying here when it's so hot. I can assure you, if it makes you feel any better, it's even hotter up here. It's roasting. Right. Okay, so my title of the talk really comes out of a piece of work that I've been doing for a while, which originally was about co-productions and really about the lack of work done on distribution policies in relation to European co-productions. But I'm going to make some wider points. So it's not just about co-productions, but about European film policy generally. So according to the European Audiovisual Laboratory report, the one that came out recently, more than 18,000 films were produced in Europe between 2007 and 2016, with overall production growing by 47% during this period, from 1,444 to over 2,000 films. So this shows an upward trend for most of the period for both national productions, but also for co-productions. And the top 5 countries producing films in Europe, the UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, themselves accounted for over half of overall production in the 36 countries covered by this analysis. So this is also a concentrated market, with the top 10 producing countries accounting for over 73% of all those films produced. On the basis of these production figures, one might conclude that the overall European film production levels are healthy, certainly in terms of numbers, if not in terms of market structure. But what about distribution? And this is where this, if you like, talk aims to hopefully add something. In analysis of European cinema, most focus has been placed on film production and co-production, and analysis of European film distribution has been less visible. I'm preaching to the converted here, because this is all about distribution. There were over 3,200 European multinational co-productions in this period between 2007 and 2016, according to the Lumiere database. In terms of European film, around a quarter of European co-productions accounted for over half of overall cinema admissions and generated 3 times as many admissions as purely national films. So there's a skewing towards European co-productions, which reach wider audiences, but also generate additional 3 times as many admissions. I guess this isn't to be unexpected. These are often the higher budget films, and of course, therefore, they're likely to reach large audiences. So there is a path dependency about this particular argument. Overall, European co-productions circulated around twice as widely as national productions, and in terms of distribution and exhibition, around 40% of the films produced in Europe between 2010 and 2015 released the theatrical release in countries other than their main production country. Overall, British, Danish, French and Irish co-productions travelled the most over the period, coming in above the EU average, which is just about 6.5 territories per film. The widest circulation reach, interestingly, is the UK, where majority co-productions from producers, many of which are wholly or partly owned subsidiaries of or financed by US companies, a number of the Hollywood majors particularly, are far more widely released than either national UK or indeed EU productions. Due to the many high-budget productions made in the UK with US producers, what is now termed by the EU Incoming Investment Productions, or GB Inc. films, a full 96% of UK majority co-productions received a release outside of the UK. For such GB Inc. films, 78% of the interactions they had were with non-European co-producers. So these are co-productions that effectively had non-European producing partners. So it's this interesting in relation to European policy and the stated aims. That's what I'm interested in. The UK is an outlier in terms of the data. Mainly these co-producers are US companies, as I've said, and therefore they're not official co-productions in the sense that they don't follow the co-production treaties, but they qualify in certain ways as European co-productions. On average, GB Inc. co-productions circulate in over 25 countries due to these linkages, and this anomalous situation has allowed a number of films to be counted as British that might otherwise be considered Hollywood films. For example, the $150 million Paramount picture Mission Impossible Rogue Nation in 2015 is considered to be a European co-production. Similarly, films such as Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy in 2011 was considered to be a European co-production, and it did indeed have European partners, even though its UK production company working title is a joint venture with the Hollywood major NBC Universal. As such, GB Inc. productions skew the distribution figures for European cinema. And so the data is quite interesting in this respect. The UK is an outlier in terms of the data. And of course then skews the information around qualifying European films. And this is very much a product of a range of different policy arrangements, but that also includes the what's called the British cultural test to qualify a film as British in order to access its status as a European production, and of course to gain UK state support in terms of the tax credit for film. So that's quite a lot of stats and data, and I won't keep doing this, I promise. Distribution then is as we all know, is the art of getting films to audiences. In Europe, distribution faces a range of challenges, which we've heard of already: linguistic diversity, different national film cultures, geographical boundaries around copyright, licensing, and so on. Co-productions are sometimes seen as a solution to this, not only to access finance and state aid for film production through subsidies and tax rebates in different national territories, but also across borders, accessing a range of funds through the European Union. They also help, of course, to increase distribution across European markets and underwrite finance and therefore risk, allowing this kind of access to be made possible. For international co-productions, distribution rights in territories are usually allocated according to that particular national producer to sell. We've heard about this in relation to the digital single market, of course. And rest of the world rights allocated according to a series of negotiations. Producers sell these rights through segmented international release windows across each territories, aided by sales agents who attend the key international film markets. And there's interesting work being done here by Roderick Smits and others on AFM, Berlin, Cannes, and others in terms of how aggregators buy these films. And this includes sales for VOD and digital distribution as well. In this context, for many European films, the importance of national and supranational film bodies and subsidies to European cinema cannot be overstated. Most governments offer subsidies, rebates, and additional funding to films that are produced within their territories, often with a range of specific conditions, such as the film being shot on location there, spending a proportion of its budget within that territory, or stipulations about percentage of spend being on domestic above-the-line talent or crew. And Vicki and other people have written about this in other contexts as well. Local production policies, such as city film offices, tend to replicate this model, encouraging spend and inward investment within their locales through financial incentives and other kinds of logistics and location support. This arguably then leads to a subsidy race that uses tax incentives to draw productions to a particular country, or a co-production to a particular country, and to obtain in return the employment of local film companies, cast and crew. A major criticism, of course, of such approaches is that such inward investment policies are a subsidy race to the bottom. From an EU perspective, supporting non-EU productions potentially has indirect economic benefits, i.e. improving their skills and infrastructure bases. However, such profits from these productions don't necessarily flow back to the domestic industries or indeed to European industries. So I just want to, that's somewhat of an introduction to what I want to talk about in terms of state support mechanisms for film distribution in Europe. So firstly, I'll talk a little bit about the media programme, and then I'm going to go on to talk a bit more about some specific digital distribution policies that are aiming to support VOD or digital release. So, Creative Europe's media programme, of course, has been launched, many people have written about this, launched in 1987 as a 3-year trial period, and it's had a range of different periods. It's run through a number of different mechanisms, a number of different schemes. Media 1, 91 to 95, Media 2, 96 to 2000, Media Plus to 2006, and Media 2007 to 2013, where most of my data is. And currently in its 2014 to 2020 iteration, seeing its budget grow from 200 million euros in the first period to approximately 800 million euros from 2014 to 2020. The number of participating countries increased from 15 in 1991 to 23 in 2002, 31 2007, currently stands at 35 members. In 2014, it was controversially put under the large umbrella of Creative Europe, which has a total budget of 1.46 billion from 2014 to 2020. So it's a significant proportion of that Creative Europe budget, as someone said earlier today. And this brings together a range of actions under the media and culture programmes that aim to support the European cultural and creative sectors. For distribution support, the media programme operates both automatic and selective funding schemes. The automatic scheme is a subsidy for theatrical distributors based on the number of paid cinema admissions in the previous calendar year for recent non-national European films. And this is based on the number of cinema tickets that are sold for those films during that year, up to a fixed ceiling and adjusted and so on. This fund must be then reinvested in either co-production of non-national European films, this is co-productions, the acquisition of distribution rights through things like minimum guarantees or MGs, or the print, dubbing and subtitling costs for non-national European films so they can reach a wider audience. The selective scheme, on the other hand, directly supports the transnational distribution of European films. This funds groups of distributors, a minimum of 7 per group in the current year, to release non-national, i.e. co-production, films that it states, quote, might be challenged were they to be supported by market forces alone, unquote. So the aim of this support is to help European film audiences to gain access to a wider range of films than otherwise would be the case. So in my following analysis, I want to offer some credit to Hugh Jones and colleagues on the SIECE project who provided me with an extracted data set compiled from the European Audiovisual Observatory's Lumiere database and also data they received from the European Commission. So, according to this data set, during the period 2007 to 2013, co-productions accounted for around 40% of European film released with media distribution support and just over half of the total media distribution budget in this period. I've got this is by the number codes for different European countries. So this shows the films with media theatrical support broken down by primary country of origin. That's the primary country in terms of a co-production, i.e. the country that was the majority co-producer. Here, co-productions are more likely to receive media distribution support than domestic features. In the period 2007 to 13, around a quarter of European films were co-productions, yet co-productions accounted for over 40% of European films released with media distribution support. That's 591 films from 1,473. And 53% of the total media distribution budget, that's 107 million euros, out of a total 201 million euros, just over, were allocated to co-productions. The larger producing nations were also the largest beneficiaries of media distribution support, especially in terms of monetary value, led by France with 66 million euros, followed by the UK with 39 million euros, and Germany, a distant third, with 20 million euros. However, Italy, the second largest producing nation of numbers of films, with 917 films after France, with over 1,600 films, actually only received 11 million euros of support, or fourth ranking. So it's an interesting that the number of films made and the amount of funding support received by, in terms of distribution from the European Union in terms of the media programme do not tally up or do not correlate at all. So, in terms of overall media distribution funding, after France, UK and Germany, the next highest levels of financial support were in the 10 to 11 million euros range, so a huge drop. This is over this five-year period. In terms of co-production funding, the largest support for nations determined by the major producer were France with 31 million euros, the UK with 19, and Germany with 10. The UK, GB Inc., that's the blue figure here, you can see, also includes incoming investment from external partners, and you'll see that's where there's an interesting figure, that 14 there. So the UK had 65 out of 66 incoming productions recorded, and 14 out of 15 that received media programme support. In terms of balance between the automatic and selective support, the majority of funding went to automatic support, about 124 million out of 201 million. Again, the largest beneficiaries of this were France and the UK, which together obtained 53% of the total distribution support from the media programme's distribution budget. A slightly lower percentage were obtained in terms of co-production, but it's just under half. So again, the two major recipients of this. Okay, so there's quite a lot of data in there, and I wanted to use that to set the scene, and there's a longer version of this that has got 4 of these tables and a lot more commentary about that particular data. But really it's to show that there's huge differentials in terms of the European support for distribution in terms of funding, and it doesn't simply follow the number of films either, and that the UK here is an outlier in terms of distribution support because of the incoming investment films, that is mainly US companies operating within the UK. So I want to turn now to talk about 2 attempts to address the digital distribution challenge, or the disruption of digital distribution by the European Union. And these are called Walk This Way and Tide Experiments. European film policies such as media programme and Euromage have tended to focus on traditional forms of distribution rather than emerging models and opportunities for digital distribution. But this has changed with a few programmes relatively recently. Of course, digital distribution, as many people have noted, does have at least the potential to reach additional audiences across a range of platforms and engage new audiences for films. And there's a lot of references that I won't go through today to indicate that. According to the data, European films, of course, are less widely distributed on VOD than US films. On average, EU films are available in 2.8 countries on VOD, US films in 6.8 countries. As a response to this, Europe has attempted a number of policy subventions. Funded by Creative Europe, Walk This Way is described as a scheme to support European producers, quote, looking to address the challenges of the digital era by coordinating experimentations on new economic models for digital film distribution. This manages the pan-European release of a catalogue of films on VOD platforms across Europe, and in its second 2016 edition, it used the digital aggregator and distributor Under the Milky Way and a marketing company called the Film Agency to release 50 European films in partnership with a whole range of production companies in different nation states. These are presented to pan-European platforms that included iTunes, Amazon, and Amazon Prime and Google Play, as well as a range of local VOD platforms. And the aim there was to increase exposure, coverage, availability, and reach greater European audiences. In addition, a digital marketing promotion campaign aimed to increase sales on a territory-by-territory basis on what they call a transversal level. In somewhat hyperbolic prose, Walk This Way describes itself as, quote, a collaborative, concrete, transparent answer for European right holders to benefit from the new forms of digital distribution. It allows for ongoing experimentations and develops sustainable, innovative business models to support the EU film industry's competitiveness. We are convinced that digital distribution represents a unique opportunity for the European film industry to go beyond frontiers and meet the digital single market objectives, like providing the EU audience with more choice, greater access to content, goods and services from EU countries. In 2016, Walk This Way provided VOD distribution for 44 films from 13 European Union countries. In 2017, it received a further grant of 1.17 million euros to do this. In an interview reported recently in Variety, Vincent Lucassen, president of the independent Pan-European Digital Association, stated that the challenge for Walk This Way, this challenge for every digital business, I guess, is to convert clicks to sales. However, despite the somewhat hyperbolic sales pitch and funding, a concrete evaluation of such European VOD support schemes is currently lacking. Without viewing data analytics, without costings, it's entirely impossible to evaluate whether Walk This Way has succeeded in its stated aims to support this wider release, or indeed to evaluate the sustainability of the new business models that it's trialling. Okay, second example. How am I for time? Okay, right. Similarly, the European Commission has attempted to support new patterns of release. For example, the Tide experiment provides a framework to provide what's called quasi-simultaneous day-and-date releases of European films across multiple platforms in different EU territories. So the day-and-date release model of releasing simultaneously online and in cinemas, but across European countries, using shared marketing material and tools. Running annually since 2012, the current iteration, Tide 5, is supported by the European Commission's preparatory action and the media programme. In addition to day-and-date model releases, Tide also has experimented, I won't talk about it here, since 2015 with festival-to-date releases, where films are released simultaneously in festivals and on VOD at the same time. And again, there's quite a lot of hyperbolic prose around the aims of this particular programme. However, once again, the evidence for the efficacy of this policy instrument in relation to the stated objectives is currently lacking. It's not to say it won't happen, but currently it's lacking. There's one sole report from 2015 that analysed 9 of the film releases and offers a useful analysis by Thomas Paris, offers a useful analysis of the actions, but avoids making a judgment, stating, quote, "The purpose of the report is not to declare these experiments as successes or failures. In a context where the cinema industry's economics and practices are undergoing profound transformation, the purpose of these experiments is to better understand the changes taking place and to anticipate the factors which determine complementarity between different distribution channels. The quantitative results of these experiments remain modest." And I'd say I've worked with the VOD platform on a project for a couple of years myself, and that very much changes with the kind of findings that we made too. The simultaneous release on VOD widens the potential audience for films, supporting access in things like remote areas where there's no cinemas, for example. And day-and-date release, therefore, could be a factor in reducing what we call the cinematographic divide. But yet, the empirical evidence is still lacking. Okay, there's a range of other examples I might give. One, just to note, the Curzon Film World received a grant of €345,000 to experiment with the simultaneous release of Tale of Tales in 2015 across multiple platforms. Again, there's not a great deal of data about that, but it doesn't look to be hugely successful from the data I've seen. The promotion of European Audiovisual Works Online scheme was launched in 2016, and this is also funding a range of projects across Europe with a grant of around 10 million euros, and includes support for things like Mubi, Curzon Home Cinema, and Out TV. Okay, so wrapping up, because I'm almost out of time, some conclusions. Okay, European policy supported films, among them many co-productions, are distributed and circulate more widely than national productions. It is not clear, however, that the effects of subsidies or policy subventions can be disaggregated from the overall performance of these films. A key issue remains demand. Audiences across Europe have access to European films, yet more often than not, they choose not to see them, whether in the cinema, on television, or on VOD. Clearly, emerging models for digital distribution of films offers a potential to reach additional audiences across a range of platforms, and could be a solution by extending the reach of these films, potentially offering greater visibility to European films. However, my analysis of support for digital distribution via VOD and day-and-date release has shown that there's currently insufficient evidence to conclude whether such potential could be realised or can be realised at the moment, and increasing dominance of major providers Netflix and Amazon Video in the European VOD market suggests that other kinds of regulation might need further consideration. Proposals towards a European digital single market will obviously also affect the film distribution business models as we've heard earlier. And many have argued about this to its potential negative effects on smaller national industries and a potential pan-European market for digital rights. In my very final comments, 2 further issues for consideration. One, of course, the UK's 2016 referendum decision to leave the European Union, which raises a whole series of questions around what impact it will have in relation to whether it's going to still be part of these schemes or not. And of course, it has been a major beneficiary, as I've pointed out, of the media programme in particular. This will, of course, affect a whole range of things in terms of those co-production and indeed the American access to the European market via the British cultural test. The second issue is that I've discussed distribution really entirely in terms of formal distribution, but a fuller analysis of film distribution and understanding audiences also needs to consider informal circulation channels, such as, of course, the consumption of pirated or informally distributed content. And as such, the audiences for European films may indeed be considerably more substantial and diverse than these official figures for formal distribution suggest. Thank you.
Thank you to Philip. And now I'll ask Patrick Fonderau from Stockholm University to respond to the papers or to discuss them.
Thank you very much for 3 rich and inspiring papers. I guess the 3 of you already did a wonderful job actually in establishing a link between your presentations. So my job is minimal, also at Slate. So I'll make it really short. So I guess a spectre is haunting this workshop, the spectre of the market. Over the course of this day, the market has been constantly invoked and conceptually framed with notions like cost, benefit, demand, supply, revenue, property, concentration, choice and abundance, and of course regulation in graphs and statistics and terminology. And you wonder, of course, what does that actually mean in the market? The notion is quite static, but there's also a lot of drama going on, as we have learned. So what kind of language do we use to describe or construct that market? So after this panel, and given that we are sitting in a cinema, actually, a site built around experience, we may reflect on how these notions and descriptions of markets relate to the conceptual edifice of humanities and social research. So what about the cultural and social dimensions of markets? And the conceptual shorthand you offered, and related to in various ways in all the papers, and which helps to think through this, is the notion of scale, I would say. So scale invoked by each of you, Ira, by pointing us to scale as a way to speak about markets, analyzing markets on discourse level, the way they are captured, speaking about types of markets, forms of market classification, how to characterize them before and now, what does small actually refer to, for instance, as a market-defining term. And Vicki, by introducing us to your ongoing fieldwork and the prehistory of a Google data center, guiding us through the different layers from global crisis and governmental policies in the Netherlands to internet exchange points and the fiber cables and Google's green data port, and by doing so methodologically crossing scales, making the conceptual tangent between micro and macro productive for your analysis, showing how cloud politics cuts through all these registers, how it affects hierarchies of territoriality, not least linking digital scales and markets back to labor and related issues. Then Phil, by beginning with noting a discrepancy between market stats and figures and by describing practices of counting productions and co-productions and then linking that to state support mechanisms for film production in Europe, arguing that schemes tend to focus on traditional forms of distribution rather than emerging models, and surveying challenges and opportunities, going with initiatives such as Walk This Way and the Tide Experiment. And just to briefly follow up on these great suggestions and perhaps stimulating for future work, we might ask, is there a pragmatics of scale? Can we describe scaling as a cultural practice or social process, given that scaling is about how, why, and to what ends people and institutions scale their work? Are there different senses of scale for the people engaging in Scala practices, from policymakers in Brussels to data center engineers? How do these scales produced by platforms, film policy, and others organize, sort, group, categorize, interpret, orient, act in our worlds? How are things made big and small, far and close? When does scaling fail? How is the production of scales related to the making of policy? What kind of scalar habits do scholars, practitioners, and policymakers follow? There's also, again, a lot of drama to scale, the drama to scale. Man, if we don't scale, that's so bad. small markets want to grow, large markets don't want to shrink. Interesting, I think, to look at all these dimensions of the phenomenon. So it's for me just to say thank you for a great end to a great day. And I guess there must be a million questions in the audience to our panelists.
You want to react now to the questions?
My answer to all of the yes/no questions is yes.
So now the floor is open to your questions and comments.
Thanks for the really interesting papers. Actually, my question is to you, Vicki. Thanks for that really interesting analysis of the development of Google's data centers. Did you say that one of the Google data executives said that the internet is not the final piece of the system, but rather a staging post or something similar to that? I mean, it's very intriguing. Okay. I just wondered whether, since you cited it, whether you have any idea, it's no doubt correct, true, but whether you have any sense of what they might have been hinting at there. And I just wondered whether it's in any way, which it possibly isn't, connected with the title of your paper, which mentions the second coming.
Yeah, so this is obviously a piece of a much larger project, and I have a whole I have another piece where I am thinking through what kind of power we give to Google in terms of regional policy and in terms of thinking about is it that all new technologies have aura, or is it Google that has a special aura that's different? How does Google use that aura? I'm giving a talk on Monday where I talk about the Google Mystique as a kind of better for them riff. And I think so there's a kind of God-like status, like the connection to media aura is prior to photography. Benjamin talks about sacred art as that having aura because you could never see it. And the thing about Google, the data centers, is like they keep aura for a property or product that you can never see. You can't go in the data center because of non-disclosures. You can't talk to anyone who works in the data center. You can't have anything to do with, like, Google's aura is precisely because there's this priesthood that, like, cultivates, like, bowing down to Google. And, like, the second coming thing is, like, just when everyone is kind of done with Google, then they're, like, expanding the data center and everybody's all crazy again. So it's like, now we're at, like, the third stage of data center development. And all the people who were, like, bummed because, like, nobody actually got hired by Google, none of their numbers make sense, nothing, like, that they say seems to, like, pan out in reality, they're all excited again. Like, ooh, Google's putting us on the map again. And another part of, like, this project, I'm really interested in how Google cultivates, like, how is it that, so there's the two layers of extra statecraft, and I'll shut up because I know I'm going on too long. I'm really excited about this. It's like, on one hand, it's like taking over public infrastructure with their own kind of governance model. But then there's this whole other layer of, like, trying to, and this gets at the scale question, trying to figure out how they take their global brand and not have it totally conflict with this regional provincial culture, which in some ways is like the antithesis of Google culture, right? It's like rural, unemployed farmers, right? And like factory workers. And then like, so what does Google do? It like sponsors butterfly programs. Like they don't even want to touch
Like they keep their aura by basically having no people involved in the things that they corporately sponsor. And then sponsor these kids programs. So I think, yeah, there's another thing coming, and it's going to be like education programs for kids and butterfly programs and things that like don't refer back to the thing they don't want to talk about, which is that their data centers put people out of work. That's what I think.
I think the smart city experiment in Toronto is another example of where that's going, in which it's being sold as a fascinating new way for cities because the smart city, the way this is going to work is that the harborfront area of Toronto will be it'll be an entire neighborhood that is run and basically run by Alphabet, and that there will be sensors and cameras and monitoring material, like monitoring things everywhere. So anyone who walks in those in that area will be monitored, and they're selling it like, well, this will be now we are involved in, we're partners in efficient city management. This isn't about the internet at all, right? This is about rethinking urban. This is part of the process whereby thinking about urban planning or urban policy is turned into a data problem.
I have a lot of questions for all y'all, but I think maybe I'll ask about, because you kind of brought up the issue of kind of space in all this. And so I have questions for Ira and Philip. Philip, what would need to happen, or is there even any discussion about kind of internet localization and thinking about these global platforms basically, dominating the market in Europe, and might the EU close off the borders to promote, in a kind of tariff sense, right, to promote local, these folks over here, these distributors. That might also relate to Vicki. I'm curious, if you can foresee a future in which like the government takes over those data centers, right, and is like, okay, we're going to actually own this now because you're not actually creating jobs. And to Ira, not really that related, but thinking about these like test markets, what are the conditions under which a test market fails? In other words, proves itself to be not a good test for the broader global economy, right? Because they're scaling something that's super specific to like something really broad.
Thanks very much for the question. There is lots of interest, and there's quite a lot of policy reports, analysis of European SVOD platforms so that there's certainly interest. And of course, the European Audiovisual Observatory, there's a range of different analyses done of the European VOD and SVOD market. Of course, it's a huge number of platforms. Some countries have hundreds of platforms, and they have on absolutely different scales. In fact, it may well beg the question: can we even talk about an SVOD or a transactional VOD platform as one thing when you have some things operating on a very micro scale for particular markets? Maybe a human rights film platform or a particular interest or around a particular film festival, and of course you have these huge global players. I think there's certainly concern and interest, and there's a range of things, meetings, and and many of the platforms themselves have been involved in some of those meetings too. Whether or not there's that regulation is cross-state, pan-European regulation around these kind of issues is obviously very difficult, and it has to require and takes a very long time. Clearly, part of the digital single market raises questions in a new light in relation to the VOD platforms. The portability rules are seen as relatively straightforward, taking your service into different countries. But in relation to what that does in terms of the market, in terms of having very much a highly concentrated market of a small number of platforms that have sort of market dominance in certainly many of the larger nation markets anyway. Actually, I think some of the presentations earlier this morning showed that actually, although we talk about Netflix and Amazon Prime and so on as being these sort of market leaders, there are actually other major platforms, and they're nowhere near market leaders in every single nation. And actually, the traditional broadcasters, catch-up players, and HBO, many others as well, are still very, very significant. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question. There's certainly a lot of, and there's increasing amount of analysis done. I suppose the biggest issue or problem for me, at least, is there isn't the transparent data. It's hard to know. We don't know about the audiences. It's not like film audience figures or box office figures that are reported, or television viewing figures that are reported. There isn't the data there. We don't have access to know how many people are watching particular programs on Netflix or Amazon or any other VOD platform. They're not required to be produced. So that's one of the key challenges, is understanding the market. You've got to have the data, and we don't have the data.
The question for me was, can I imagine the government taking over data centers? No.
Just to pick up on Phil's point too, it's such a big problem with the conception of markets, of course, is data, as you say. And in Netflix's case, the Canada's broadcasting regulator a number of years ago called Netflix to testify, basically, in these kind of quasi-public hearings, quasi-legal hearings. And every single time the regulator would ask questions like how many subscribers, Netflix would lean over and say, none of your business, and you have no jurisdiction to ask, and we don't have to answer. And the regulator's reaction was to expunge them from the record, like telling Netflix, you're no longer on the public record anymore. Your testimony is no longer valid. And so it's such an important part of that story. I love this question so much. Because for two reasons. Well, one is it's hard to answer, but the other one is that it draws attention to the really fascinating aspect of media studies that deals with questions of failure, and of course the question of test market fails. Of course, failure is so hard to measure because, of course, as Gillian pointed out earlier, which is like what counts as a success, and when do we know that something has failed, and if you fail now, is it something that happens later? So, for example, in where I'm from, in Ottawa, the capital city, the city newspaper, the Ottawa Citizen, is owned by a large group of by a company that owns a number of different local papers, and they tested out an afternoon edition of newspapers. So the idea was, like, in the afternoon you would get like the 4 o'clock edition of the news, in a sense, harkening back to the old history of newspapers. And it was a complete flop. It was a total flop. And the problem there, and the idea, I think, was that Ottawa was supposed to be sort of the test, which was, if afternoon editions work in Ottawa, then the company will try it out in some other markets. And because Ottawa at the time had a fairly stable, not a large, but a fairly stable readership of that particular newspaper, that seemed like an ideal place to test it out. And many people have talked about, many people in the newspaper business have talked about that idea as a very powerful fail, both in the sense that design-wise it was perfect, the delivery was really good, aesthetically it was also really good, but that some people say that it was intended to fail on purpose, which was, it was intended to fail so the parent company could go back and to start laying off more people, and then to go to the government and say, you should break with established practice and start to directly subsidize newspapers, which is something that in Canada we didn't do. And for many years, the Canadian government said no, it won't. But just recently, they have come up with a bit of a funding scheme, which is not direct subsidies to newspapers, but subsidies into funds that will support community journalism or certain kinds of journalism. Now, again, I'm connecting 2 points that probably don't need to be connected here, but is a failure now on an afternoon newspaper may be a success like 5 years later. And so thinking about, so that's one way to think about test markets. But I mean, you can think about all of those other, I think one of the biggest fails is the news coming out of the U.S. When the No, but the idea that Facebook allowed advertisers to target people who liked people who like white supremacy, for example, and they were, in a sense, presented to people as a test market. Or every single time the major platforms roll out new changes, right? So Facebook changing its news feed, or changes to Instagram, or Twitter. Every time those things happen, there's always this kind of backlash about oh my God, everything's changed. Like, what are we going to do? Take it back to normal? Increase the number of characters, decrease the number of characters in Twitter, in a tweet. So it's a long and unruly answer. I'm sorry, but I do think it points to the bigger question of what are the parameters for success. But I want to think about that more. So thanks.
Peter, you had a question, or?
So it seems we have heard several stories about how American or global giants are hijacking public money, public policies, public service media in Europe, especially in smaller countries. And it seems that we have had the aura of Hollywood, actually, and Prague is a very good example for this. There were years when the incoming investment, especially from the US, was like 20 times bigger than the overall investment into the domestic production. So it was actually sort of international runway production kind of industry going on here, although people didn't perceive it that way, especially the policymakers. And now we have the aura of IT, of Google, which is, actually sort of used to hijack the public money and policy. So my question is, what is actually a way out of it, and what is our role in explaining the policymakers? What are the specific interactions or specific dangers of this kind of subsidizing actually global companies coming to small countries which can't really regulate on themselves? They need European Union, because all the giants can just say, I leave this small market altogether. I don't care. But if it's 28 markets, it's a big difference. It's a big difference. And the question is actually what is the right perspective for us to talk to the policymakers, and how actually, and also what is the role of Google and Amazon and others in the, especially in the digital market strategy discussions, because that's something we haven't touched on yet. How they are actually trying to put their foot into the door.
I feel like I can't. It's not my role. Like, I'd be like the wrong person as an American to tell Europeans how to respond to the neo-colonial situation that my country has done since the beginning of silent cinema. There's a great book coming out from UC Press that traces. It's a production study of runaway production in Europe since like 1945. I have to pull up the author, but it's fabulous. I mean, it just shows the way I kind of look at it is that governments are between a rock and a hard place. I mean, what are the options when national governments go through austerity and then they cut off funding? You got to supply that somehow, right? And Google and Amazon, they offer a way, right? They offer an option. So I sympathize a lot with the kind of plight of regional governments who, have gone through just successive pedagogies of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and then being faced with, but we can't pull ourselves up if nobody lays the table,
right? So, or we can't pull ourselves up if nobody's going to build the cell phone towers. So that's, I think the history, that's why I'm kind of interested in these historical moments, because I feel like we're so focused already always on like the contemporary moment. We don't see that it was like a long string of dominoes that kind of led to this happening, and it could have happened another way, but what's the response to it now? I feel like in each place that there needs to be a conversation, first of all, that it's even, that, yeah, it's okay to emote about this.
Any other questions?
I just want to say I feel really bad for all of the Americans out there with tons of jet lag. I see you guys fading, and I'm sorry.
Right.
It's not a question, it's just a remark. Now the copyright directive for digital single market is discussed because we were talking about missing data on Netflix user. And one of the articles is claiming the transparency obligation for the holders of the licenses. They will be obliged to inform the creators about the scope of the use of their works. Because of additional payment, if there is a big discrepancy between the commercial profit of the distributor and what the authors were paid, so they should be able to ask for the additional payment. So maybe it will change.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I mean, it is obviously the lack of data is an issue, and I mean, having interviewed a number of producers who have sold the rights to their films to Netflix and Amazon, they get very little data themselves. So they don't have, and actually the VOD platform that I work with, I mean, there was a big struggle over how much data we were able to use and reveal. But at least the producers, the people who obviously had made the content or produced the content, did have access to the platform. They could look at the analytics. So that was one of the big incentives they had for the platform, was that they were able to get this kind of information about who was actually watching their films and what they were interested in, where they're from, and all this sort of stuff that they weren't going to get from the other platforms. I think there is probably a distinction to be made as well, though, between Amazon, and they have more than one model anyway. Amazon's Prime Video, they have the transaction, they have the transaction and the subscription models, and they have slightly different kinds of offerings, I think, to producers when they sell rights or when they buy rights than Netflix. They I don't know if there's not the exclusive rights deals that Netflix impose on all Amazon products, for example. So I think there are kind of nuanced differences between even these large players, and quite clearly in terms of the commissioning, the way they're approaching their relationship to cinemas, film festivals, for example, is quite different from that of Netflix. So that's also a key thing. But it will be interesting to see if the European Union forces certain forms of transparency onto these platforms.
I would have a question for Vicki. I can. Could you expand a bit? I know that you have just said that the data centers are kind of black boxes, but could you expand a bit on the organizational culture, perhaps? Maybe can you say something about professional ideology? Is there any Google-specific professional ideology that the workers have to follow? Any kind of self-perception that is shared?
It's like Google workers are like unicorns. Like they're like, I know they're out there, but like finding one, I've been working in Groningen now for, 9 months, and I haven't met a Google worker, nor even know anyone who knows a Google worker, I follow Google job ads. They outsource all the jobs that are not part of their core business, so they're all on temp job boards, so I know about their so the Google data center, 40 football fields, employs 150 direct workers. of those, maybe 20 are systems engineers, and the rest do things like security, landscaping, cleaning filters in the AC units, catering. I don't know if there's a professional ideology around catering, but I'm sure there is. But the thing is that these are like crappy temp jobs, and they're for Google because it's like, why not work for the greatest tech company in the world and make €10 an hour? So that's explicit, right, in the ads. But everybody who works for Google signs a non-disclosure agreement, and the only way I've been able to get any insight into that world are the workers who then sue in U.S. courts, who then have to submit their non-disclosure agreements as part of evidence. And the one that's going through the courts right now, the CDA says, if you're hired for Google, you may not talk about anything not known to the general public about Google for your working career. So it's a black box on purpose. Like, they don't want anyone to know it. They'd much rather make slick videos that show, happy farmers going off to the wind farm and happy kids playing on Chromebooks. I've talked to lots of people in data centers, like just, your vanilla kinds of, data centers, Equifax and banks and things like that. And, it's like boy IT, work culture, pretty much. And then a lot of people doing kind of ancillary, caretaking jobs. One thing that was really interesting is this guy was telling me data centers aren't built for people. They hate people. Servers hate people. The more people that are around servers, the more likely they are to fail. They don't even keep the oxygen in data centers. They just keep it barely at the level that would sustain a living person walking among them, because servers don't need oxygen. So, you want to talk about a labor future? Nice. So all the work that I've done around production cultures and stuff like that, I have to rethink that whole project, because this is the scary side of the future of work. This is not. We're gonna. I don't know where this goes next.
An optimistic conclusion.
Yeah, cocktail.
Are there any further questions? If not, then there is a reception starting in 5 minutes in the cinema. So you'll see that. You are invited. Thanks for your endurance. Thanks for today.